Coming back to part 2 of Muckle Chapter 10 on economics, we're talking about reciprocity here. Remember, um, there's three basic economic processes: reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. Reciprocity is the one that rules in bands and tribes. That is, in societies that are foraging, where they're hunting or gathering, and in societies that have small gardens or that herd crops. Pretty much generalized reciprocity is the main thing, what we call the gift economy. Generalized reciprocity says the value of a gift is not specified at the time of exchange nor the time of repayment. The time of repayment is also not specified. Basically, um, I give you something, and at some point you give me something back. This is known as the gift economy. Social relationships are more important than the value of the thing being gifted. Hoarding and concentrating food is strongly condemned. Selling food is strongly condemned, except for people who, that's their job is to sell food. And then it's sort of, they're kind of shady people. They don't really belong with the rest of us because really, honestly, whenever anyone is hungry, they should be fed. Some of us have country backgrounds. We have our grandparents or great grandparents that we can remember talking about how nobody is turned away. Somebody turns up at dinner time and you just add a place to the table and you feed them. In Ghana, where I grew up, as well as in Egypt and Morocco, where I've lived, there's never a question about food. If you are eating food and somebody walks up, you say, tafaddal. You say, here, take some. You're invited, you say in Ghana. You're invited. You need to eat this food with me because I don't feel right about eating in your presence and you not having any food. It's just fundamentally evil for anyone to ever hoard food and to eat and leave anyone else. Everyone is always invited. There's always room around the table. Food is really key. Food is greatly loved and specified endlessly. Different kinds of food, different shares of food, different cuts of meat, etc. But one thing that everyone can agree on in gift economies is food should never ever be refused to anyone. If anyone wants any food, you always just give it to them. But apart from food, now we're talking about a gifting. So, or prestigious kinds of food, um, um, but definitely anything else, any kinds of tools or objects of value or beauty. These are traded, not traded in the sense of given in exchange for. Traded is gifted around. I give you a gift, and then in sometime in the next, I don't know, 3 weeks to 10 years, you gift me back. So there's not this kind of this bartering, right? This idea that we get sometimes because we see when there's a breakdown of a money economy, people start bartering stuff. So, like my grandma when she was little, they had chickens. They had no money for shoes. And so they would go to the neighbors and say, "Hey, do you have any old shoes?" And they'd be like, "Here, we got some shoes." And they'd say, "Okay, we'll give you 5 eggs for those, for that pair of used shoes." And they would barter. That's not how it works in a gift economy. And 1,000 years ago in France, um, if you were living there, you were probably a peasant, but you needed shoes, and there was a guy who made shoes, and he was also a peasant, but he was a really good shoemaker. And you're a peasant, but you've got a lot of chickens. And so the guy, you'd go over to the guy, you'd say, "Hey, I need another pair of shoes," and he'd be like, "Okay, let me take your measurements. Come back in a week or so." And he'd go back in a week and give you a pair of shoes. And then, like maybe a year later, he would come by and he'd say, "Hey, I'm kind of hungry, and the shoes, I don't have anything. We're out of luck." And he'd say, "Here, take a couple of hens. They'll lay eggs for you, right? Because that's just what we do. Because you gave me shoes 5 years ago, I give you shoes now." And then a couple years after that, maybe his daughter is getting married. Or his daughter is looking for a husband, and your son is looking for a wife, and so you get married. And the true point of that is a social relationship. That's what's key. The key is not in the value of the item being gifted. The item being gifted does not make the relationship more important. The more important relationship raises the value of the item being gifted. and the goal is always to maintain those social relationships. Stuff will wear out and break, but your true friends will never let you down. Food processors, food producers. Now we have horticulturalists, pastoralists, and farmers. So this is tribal society. If you remember, we have bands, tribes, and chiefdoms prior to the state, and these are the tribes. So these people produce a little bit of their food. Horticulturalists are gardeners and pastoral nomads with limited control over their food production. So horticultural is foodways, food production, alongside continued gathering. Remember, even when we have groups that are growing stuff in their garden, they have a very limited number and variety of plants, flora. They'll still have a wide variety of fauna because they're still hunting in the forest. Even with groups that are growing their own sheep, and their fauna is very, very limited. Just always sheep, bits of sheep bones and whatever. They'll still have lots and lots of flora very often because they're still going out and gathering wild nuts, wild berries, etc. There's continued gathering alongside the food production. Social organization, we have a leveling mechanism, a means of distributing accumulated wealth so that nobody accumulates more than anyone else. That's key, is to maintain the basic equality among people in these tribal societies. Pretty much everyone is equal to everyone else. There's no bosses. And if anyone does start to accumulate too much, then they're pretty roundly criticized, because hoarding is very bad in these sorts of situations. Hoarding is always bad. Horticulturalists in the environment, even in our modern economy, we're getting there. Horticulturalists in the environment, we have swidden cultivation, shifting cultivation, slash and burn, extensive agriculture. These are all names for swidden cultivation. Basically, this takes place in forests where you have a very thin soil. Let's see if we can find some of this. Let's look down in Papua New Guinea. I just know this because I was just teaching a whole book about it. So here's Papua New Guinea. It's down in Southeast Asia. It's between Indonesia and Australia. It's an island nation, but a huge island. And so the group that we were studying in my other class were living around Papandetta, and they have there's sort of lowland farms, but they have a new processing plant for palm nuts. But if you go out into the countryside a little bit farther away, you can see land that hasn't been influenced by this cash crops. And you can see here what's going on is you have this is where the village used to be, maybe 100 years ago, or just probably 20 years ago. This is where it used to be 20 or 30 years ago. The trees are just starting to come back. Here's where they're living now. They moved over here, and they have little gardens here. They'll burn down an acre or 2 or 3 acres and plant their garden there, and then after 3 or 4 years, they'll move over to higher forest, and then 100 years ago, this is where the village was. 50 years ago, this is where the village was. You can see higher and higher levels of trees, and so after 150 or 200 years, where you got big trees, then the village will move down here, and they'll cut down the trees, clear out a little forest clearing, and grow their garden vegetables there, plant their fruit trees there, their bananas and their papayas and their root vegetables. And so that's just how it's done. It looks like virgin forest, but it's mainly a sort of long-term sustainable forest management. Small plot in the forest is cleared using fire. The plot is used for planting crops over the course of 3 or 4 seasons. The nutrients in the thin forest topsoil become depleted. The plot is then left to lie fallow for several decades or even centuries, and another nearby plot is cleared and planted. You see slash and burn, you think, oh, this is terribly unsustainable, but actually it's a very sustainable technique of forest management. It has been used by literally thousands of years on the same area. It is extensive. It takes a lot of land for a small village to keep alive, but it works. And that's what we're talking about. This is how gardening people get food. They still continue to hunt in that forest for antelope or wild pigs or whatever, but they grow their own vegetables, and sometimes they keep pigs at home too. Okay, that's 10.